So here's some basic things that you can do in Python. You can print. So the first thing that we usually do is we print hello world. Whenever you print something, you put what you want to have shown up on the screen in parentheses. And if it's text that you want to have show up, it has to be inside quotes. So the print statement always comes with parentheses. I have a bad habit of using double quotes. You don't need to. You can use single quotes. If I would recommend, if you're just starting out, to get in the habit of just using single, because you don't have to press shift when you do it. But when I first learned, I had to use double, and so I still use double. Once you have some code that you want to see what it does, you go over to run and you say run module. Notice the shortcut is the F5 key. Lots of times people like to get used to that. So they run module. You have to give it a name, like save it as a file. So maybe we'll run it, we'll call it first. Everything always ends in .py, as you can see down here. It's looking for py files. If you don't put that in, it will put it in automatically. So that's fine. You may want to create a folder where you save all your stuff. You can see various times that I've done that, right? So maybe I'm going to make a coding 2019 folder, and then when I need to save stuff for this class, I know that they'll be in coding 2019. Once that it saves, then it actually, see right here, it's running this program, the first.py program. What does that program do? It prints or outputs hello world to the screen. So this is the results of my program. It does something here, shows me the results over here. So what are some other things that we can do? Well, the main thing that we're going to learn first is we're going to learn about variables. So you can create something. Now, the famous variable that we use in math class, of course, is x, right? So what if x equals 5? So there's different things that we can have show up on the screen. If I want to print the number 5, I could just say print 5. If I want to print the letter x, I could say x. Oh, see, there I go again. X, like that. But if I want to store the number 5 into a spot in my computer's memory that we will label x, and the way I always talk about it is it's like a box inside your computer that has placed the number 5 in it and stores it there. If I just say print x, this is now this. So it's not the letter anymore, which is inside quotes. It's not a number anymore. It's a variable. It's something that stores information. When I run this, it'll ask me to save it again. I'll say okay. Now let's just take a look at this in order. It's still going to say, right, it says hello world here. When I run it, it starts over again. So the first thing it does is it says hello world. Then it prints the number 5 because I told it to print 5. Then it prints the letter x because I told it to print x. And then it prints the number 5 again because it's printing the value of x, which is 5. If I was to update x and I say now x is 7, when it runs that, because the computer always does things from the top to the bottom, it always goes in order. It prints the first thing. It stores 5 into x. It's going to print 5 in x. Then it's going to store 7 into x. And x, as a memory location, can only have one thing in it at a time. So we just took out the 5 and put in the 7. And so when we print it, I would expect to see the number 7 there. And there we go. And so you can go on and do things like that. Now, the main thing we want to do, and I'm just going to, let me just show you something interesting here. I'm going to comment out the region. What that means is these are now all comments, which are notes that you can put to yourself. Here is a note to myself. And programmers do this all the time to explain what they're doing inside their code. You can imagine I have a big block of code and I say, this code does this, and I explain it. By doing this, what I'm saying is I don't want to erase this code, because what if I want it later? But I don't want the computer to do it right now. So when I actually run this program now, it does nothing because all of this is ignored. This is just information for the coder, but it's not anything that does outputs anymore. But down here, I want to show you some things about variables. So there are 4 types of variables that you, or data types is what we call them, that the computer can store. The first one is the computer can store an integer. And so let's just say I have something called number, and I set it equal to 4. That's an integer, right? A whole number. If I was to print number to the screen, I would expect 4 to show up. This is interesting. If I was to print and ask for the type that my number is, what data type is my number, so it's going to print out the type of what's inside the parentheses. So it's going to take a look at number, and it's going to say what type of data is that, and it's going to print that out on the screen. So when I run this, it's 4, and that is of the class int or integer. So that's important for the computer because it needs to know how to store that information, and it's really easy for the computer to store an integer. It converts it into binary and can store it inside the computer's memory. Let's take a look at another type. If I was to say, hey, my name is Fred, and again, this could have been single quotes. It doesn't matter at all, but either way works. And I was to say print name, and then I was to say print, well, what is the type for the name? And then I run that. And so the first one will run again. It will be 4, an integer. Fred is of the class string. So a name or text that is inside quotes, we call that a string. And that's what str stands for. So those are 2 very different things. In fact, I could put the number 4 in here, and now it's treating it as text instead of as an integer. What does that mean? Can I add text? Does it make sense to say what is Fred plus Nancy, right? It doesn't make any sense to say that. Well, up here you can imagine I could have said 4 plus 5. So you can't, if I would make a string, I cannot add information to that anymore. And so that's why you have to think to yourself, what am I doing with this information? Okay, now there's another one that's important, and that's what if you have a number, but it's not a whole number. It's a real number meaning any decimal number. Well, so let's just say I do something like that, and I say I want to print pi, and then I want to print type pi. So again, this is a real number. Let's see what the computer calls it. Okay, so it prints out 4.1 blah blah blah. That is called a float, or a floating point decimal is what we call it. So whole numbers equals integers, which equals, for the computer, it calls it an int. Text is a string, which the computer calls str. And real numbers are called floating points, which the computer calls a float. So those are they're all referring to the same thing. If I was to ever say, find a real number, that's what I'm talking about. If I was to say find a floating point number, it's what I'm talking about. If I was to say find a float, it's what I'm talking about. And then finally, there's one more type, and people often say, well, why do I want this type? And it's actually really handy to have. So let's just say I'm asking a question of if something is true or false, such as, do I own well, yeah. By this I mean, like, if I was making a game like Fortnite and I want to know, has my guy picked up, a weapon yet to use, I might have this, where if I own something, it's true, and if I don't own something, it's false. So I could print gun, and I could print the type, of gun, and that doesn't mean what kind of gun is it. It means what data type is the variable gun. And I was to run this, and here we go. It prints, the integer, it prints the string, it prints the float, and then the newest thing I did prints out the word false, and it's a class bool. This is called a Boolean integer. So true or false equals Boolean, and did I say Boolean integer? Boolean data. And this is called bool. So this is really handy in computers to be able to set things to true or false, and so we use these a lot. For the computer, it's really easy to store this information because false could be represented by the number 0 and true could be represented by the number 1, and that just takes one bit of data in order to do it. So, that makes it really nice and easy. All right. Last thing to note is that this does not work. It has to be a capital T. That's what indicates that it's a Boolean. So there we go. So there's just a quick primer on how to print things and how to make variables, and everything else from here will be explained in assignments, but I wanted to show you how to get started and what some of the basics of Python are. So good luck.